listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Open Book, Open Mind. I'm your host, always have been, and still am to this day, Edgar Chaput. Open Book, Open Mind is the podcast where we discuss books, mostly novels, although that may or may not change in the near future. And, we don't have to like the book, we just have to open it, read it, and keep an open mind. On this episode, I wanted to talk about something particular. I would say, and this is going to sound a little bit strange because I'm going to talk pop culture films for just a minute or two here. I would say the origin story, if you will, of this episode goes back about a decade. I know in these days, say spring, summerish 2025, at the time of this recording, the Disney and its Marvel Cinematic Universe is not doing that well, in the sense that some of the most recent movies were not particularly well received. They're not making nearly as much money at the box office as some of the earlier films have. But nevertheless, this concept of a cinematic universe, which Marvel's doing, and I guess Star Wars to an extent, is doing, and DC is trying. At the time of this recording, the James Gunn Superman film hasn't been released just yet, but it looms on the horizon. And a lot of people, again, that's one of those sentences, a lot of people. Well, how many, who exactly are you talking about? The ill-defined, a lot of people, generally who consume pop culture are aware of what a cinematic universe is. I guess comic book readers would be familiar with what comic book universes are. A particular character has their own film, but then they'll make a cameo in another one, and there'll be team-ups and this and that. Well, not so long ago, about a decade ago, or even less than that, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, if I'm being completely honest, I was oblivious to the fact that the notion of a shared universe is not an exclusivity to pop culture. It's been going on for a while, and much to my own amazement, although maybe less so as the last few years have evolved, and I've done some digging and educated myself, if I can use that sort of a strange term, is that the idea of continuity and to an extent shared universes, well, that applies to the world of literature. Now, I'm going to cite one example in particular that I have dived into for about 4 plus years, if my timeline makes any sense. And it is Émile Zola's Rougon Macquart, which I guess in English would be the Rougon Macquarts. I've never heard the title in English. Basically, it's Rougon is ROUGON dash MACQUART, Rougon Macquart. In French, Rougon Macquart. Émile Zola was a 19th century French author. He did quite a bit. He was a journalist, he was a political journalist, he was a playwright, quit school fairly early, got a job with a publishing house named Hachette, which was based in France. So he got the inside scoop of what the world of publishing, literature publishing, was like from a very early age. I believe he was in his early to mid-20s when he got that job. Émile Zola, by the way, born 1840, passed away in 1902. And he is mostly known for this saga, this 20-novel saga of Les Rougon Macquart. Now, Rougon and Macquart are two families, the two primary rival families, political rivals, economic rivals that have these very extended family branches, and the story or stories, the saga of Rougon Macquart extends over several years. As I understand it, it extends at least over a decade, if not two. Why am I unclear on that figure? Well, I've only read 5 of the 20 books. As a matter of fact, it was, I think, during the pandemic, or maybe we were coming out of the pandemic. I hadn't read an Émile Zola in a long, long time. I had read one of his books, but it was donkeys years ago. And at total random, I picked up something called The Lady's Paradise. Unbeknownst to me, that is book 11 of this larger saga, Les Rougon Macquart. Now, I would say, certainly by reading Lady's Paradise, that the stories are sufficiently independent that you can follow the plot from start to finish. You know, they all have beginnings, middles, and ends. Having read 5 of these so far, I can attest to the fact that they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But there are certain recurring characters or references to things and that have happened in the previous entries. Now, I didn't know that when I read Lady's Paradise, but I was, funnily enough, the one I read most recently, which was the in French, it's La Conquête de Plassans, I guess the Conquest of Plassans, which is a town in France, outside of Paris. Plassans, P-A-L-S-S-A-N-S. And there's actually a character who is forget secondary character, a tertiary character in the Conquest of Plassans, who is I would say, strong supporting character, a strong secondary character in Lady's Paradise. But of course, I didn't know it at the time. And what struck me about Lady's Paradise was, yes, the characters in it, such as the owner of a women's clothing store, and this new employee, a young demoiselle, who's very shy. She may or may not be attracted to this owner of the store, the manager / owner of the store, who's a bit of a severe character, a stern character. Not necessarily rules the store with an iron fist, but he's a bold decision maker. So you have the relationships between those two characters, their own family and friends, most notably the young mademoiselle, who's the actual protagonist of Lady's Paradise. She and her young siblings, they're staying with family in Paris. This clothing store is in downtown Paris. And they're from the countryside, but misfortune has befallen them, and probably something we find out in the previous books, now that I think of it. And so they try to make a life for themselves in Paris, and we follow the protagonist, which is this demoiselle who works for the clothing store, who is owned and run by someone who, unbeknownst to me, was already a figure in Rougon Macquart, Lady's Paradise being the 11th book, and the owner of the store is actually introduced in The Conquest of Plassans, which is the 4th book. And I really appreciated Zola's style. Now, Lady's Paradise is extremely specific. It's not so much about the politics of 19th century France, which in of itself is quite fascinating, with revolutions, restorations, counter-revolutions, royalty lineages that are up for debate and parties can't get along, subcultures of societies can't get along because they can't really decide or agree on who should be the leader. There were a few Napoleons who led the countries. There were a few kings who led the countries. There was a general who led the country. It's a pretty complicated time in France from a political standpoint. But, of course, 19th century also suggests great technological advancements. The Industrial Revolution was not that long ago. That's spreading globally, certainly at least in Europe. And entrepreneurship is progressing as well, the way businesses are run. And The Lady's Paradise is, whilst diving into the interpersonal relationships of the characters, is also about how big box stores, brick and mortar stores, are not running the risk, but the mom and pop shops are running the risk of being tossed to the curb by the big brick and mortar stores. So there's a lot going on in Ladies' Paradise. It's said that Zola was interested in realism, and I understand that, although I have to say the way he describes certain places and times and periods of the day and settings is quite vivid. In fact, there's a passage, in a chapter in Ladies' Paradise, which frankly is one of the greatest things I've ever read in my entire life. It's the day where the store has a sale, and it seems as though all the ladies of Paris spend the entire day in the store. The clothing, the fabrics, the scarves, yarns of this, yarns of that, sheets of this, sheets of that. It's utter madness in the store. The colors are everywhere, and people are laughing. They're going up to the upper level floors, the lower level floors. The employers are doing what they can to keep abreast of things and managing the place. There's a lot of activity. There's a lot of color. There's a lot of emotion, and it's all within the prism of this business, the emotionality that we all feel sometimes when we go to a store that we like a lot, and we're ready to spend a lot of money. You know, on that particular day, we're high rollers and a ton of stuff is on sale. And yeah, sometimes emotions run high. Positive emotions, mind you, positive emotions. And consumerism is quite a high sometimes. And that chapter in Ladies' Paradise definitely exudes the high, the dopamine kick that we feel when we're consuming, which is very, very interesting. And again, keep in mind, this is a book from, I think, the 1860s or maybe the 1870s. It's very, very interesting. And so that's when I discovered that The Lady's Paradise is, in fact, book 11 of Rougon Macquart. So I went back to read the earlier ones, and I've sort of given myself the task of trying to read one per year, which would mean I would take 20 years to read the whole thing. I don't know if I'm going to keep that pace. Maybe I'll try to sneak in a couple per year. But you have the Fortune of Les Rougons, which is the first book. You have La Curée, which is the second one. The Belly of Paris, which is the fourth one. And Conquête of Plassans, which is the fourth one, which is the one I literally just finished at the time of this recording. Well, literally, a couple days ago. I wanted to let it simmer before I recorded anything. And now there are some pros and cons to reading only one per year, especially when the stories, at least through the first 4 books. I'm gonna put aside the 11th one because again, that's 7 books from now where I'm at. But yeah, the stories do branch off a little bit. I would say the Fortune of Les Rougons and the Conquest of Plassans are the two that are the most closely linked so far. Belly of Paris and La Curée, they tend to branch off a little bit. As a matter of fact, despite the fact that I read The Belly of Paris about a year ago, I tend to read them at more or less the same time of year. I don't know why that is. It's sort of become a tradition. So this is the 4th year in a row where in the springtime, April-ish, May-ish, you know what I'm talking about, I pick one up and I read it. So it was only about 12 months ago that I read The Belly of Paris, and it's the one I remember the least about. I actually remember more about the first 2 than I do about the third. And I think one of the reasons for that is that the first book also takes place in Plassans. And Plassans is this interesting location where, at least in the 4th book, La Conquête de Plassans, there is a looming election. The town needs to send a representative to the legislature in Paris, I believe in Versailles, and the main political rivalries are between the Legitimists and the Bonapartistes. The Bonapartists, the Legitimists are the political clique in 19th century France that believe that he who should rightfully lead the country is in fact part of the royal lineage, whereas the Bonapartists are, well, it's in the name. They believed in the French Revolution. They believed in what Napoleon Bonaparte was trying to accomplish, and they want to be more sort of a republic in that sense. Again, keep in mind, Napoleon III was also ruler of France. So, there is the French Revolution, then there's the Restoration, where the Legitimists got what they want. Then there was the July monarchy, which very few people seem to agree on. It didn't necessarily satisfy the Bonapartists, but it didn't necessarily satisfy the Legitimists. Napoleon III was part of the equation for a few years after the July monarchy of 1830. So you have this looming election where various candidates want to present themselves, and out of the blue, well, as we discover, maybe not so out of the blue, one of the matriarchs of these two families, of the Rougon family, has an agreement to bring a priest to the town. Now, this town already does have some priests, but there's this one that seems to come out of the blue. He's a very stern personality. He's not particularly friendly, always dressed in black, and there's a lot of suspicion about him. And he's staying over at this. He's rented a room on the second floor of where this family lives. It just so happens that the mother and the father in this family come from these two strands. The mother is a Rougon, and the father is a Macquart. And so this priest shows up. Nobody seems to really trust him at first, but as we start to discover, his role is in fact to win over this town with projects that are charitable at first, and they are truly charitable. They're good ideas to help the youth of the city, and he sort of becomes a popular figure. Everybody starts to like him, especially the ladies start to like him. Not exactly what that sentence usually means. It's more a fascination, an interest, a respect. But the men who are the politicians, again, it's mid-19th century France after all, and the men sort of are won over by him as well. And basically the end game here is that usually Plassans has sent to the French legislator, the French commons, if you will, although that's not how they called it in France, were Legitimists, those who believed in the royal lineage of the Bourbons, who should lead the country. And they've won these elections handedly for several years already, several campaigns already. But this matriarch of the Rougon wants to send someone who's against that, someone who's maybe much for the Republic and not so much the Empire, and so this priest's mission, cloak and dagger mission through charity, is to convince the town through very nice gestures that to change their political representative. So it's a very, very interesting book about a unique way in which religion will influence politics, not necessarily by making people particularly religious, which might be, a criticism some could lambast, the United States with sometimes. A lot of their politicians are fervently religious and they don't hide it, which in of itself isn't necessarily a problem. But again, this seems to be almost the more subtle version of that, where the politicians themselves are not necessarily super religious. They're not necessarily passionately invested in religion, but you have this priest who is, playing everyone like puppets, playing everyone like puppets on a string or like pawns. It's quite interesting. And the family who is hosting this priest, the mother by the name of Martha, she's not a very religious person. She spends most of her days at home. Hubby is a former wine seller, I believe. He's certainly a merchant, an entrepreneur, mostly in wine, maybe some other products. It's not really that important. He doesn't work that much anymore. He's sort of approaching retirement, if you will. They've made their money, and he's sort of jovial, but he can be a little bit too abrasive at times. Not mean, but he's a little bit full of himself sometimes. And the mother is more reserved. She's much quieter. And the arrival of this priest sort of opens her eyes to new projects that she can work on, and she gets involved in these charitable projects. The first one being they instill a program in the town to help young adolescent and young adult women who might be tempted by less than savory activity. So it's sort of a program to guide them, a little bit of education, a little bit of religious education. And she becomes involved in that. And as the story goes along, her involvement in not just these charitable projects, but in religion itself, her belief in God and in trying to be saved and investing herself in faith, reaches a fever pitch. So it's an interesting story in the sense that it's mostly about, I would say, it's mostly about the art and power and price we pay sometimes because of persuasion. Who's persuading whom, how, why, and what happened? What is the aftermath once the other party has been persuaded? The matriarch, so not Martha, but Martha's mother. Martha's mother needed to persuade the priest to come to Plassans. The priest needs to convince the rival political factions of Plassans to agree to send this one candidate. The priest convinces Martha to engage in a charitable project, a charitable organization. She convinces herself that she needs to become super religious all of a sudden. And all these things have their consequences, if you will. Even the father, François Mouret, so Martha's husband in this, he needs a bit of convincing to open himself up to this priest. He is the first one to be suspicious of this priest, but then he comes to like him, and then that starts to flip-flop after a while, and people in the house are persuaded that the father should be ousted, and they start disrespecting him more and more, and he starts the story as the boisterous character, and then he becomes the more quiet, reserved, and standoffish character, whereas the mother, Martha, was the standoffish, quiet character, and she becomes boisterous at the end. But it's all through the power of different variations of persuasion. So that was my main takeaway from the conquest of Plassans. Persuasion, political, religious, personal, the idea of salvation. It's really, really quite interesting, extraordinarily well written, and definitely, I don't know if it's not necessarily my favorite of the 5 Rougon Macquarts that I've read so far, but it might be my second favorite. I'd still say Lady's Paradise is my favorite, but I would say The Conquest of Plassans is a close second, or at least it's probably battling it out with The Fortunes of the Rougon. And again, so you have these recurring characters. It's not a cinematic universe, it's a literary universe. And I did not know that such a thing existed just a handful of years ago. And let me tell you listeners, it's quite an experience to discover something like this. And yes, I am aware that there are many, many other ones. Who knows, maybe for me, in my literary journey as a reader, this could only be the beginning. There you have it. That was another episode of Open Book, Open Mind. I've been your host, Edgar Chaput. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't hesitate to leave any comments in the comments section. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and we will check you again in the next one. Cheers.